Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the closing session of the Berlin Climate Security Conference 2021. My name is Hinrich Tölken and I'm your moderator for the next 60 minutes. Over the past 2 weeks, we have been talking about the most urgent issues in climate security, from gender, mediation, peacekeeping and peace building, to adaptation and cross-sectoral approaches to climate security. One very strong theme which has emerged across all discussions is the need for joined-up responses, working across sectors, countries, institutions, and across different components of the security apparatus. Today, in this closing session, we will look at the concept of comprehensive security to understand what it entails and how we can pursue it. We have an excellent panel of experts and expertise representing some of these different sectors and perspectives here today to discuss the opportunities and pitfalls of advancing a comprehensive approach to address climate-related security risks. In light of time restraints, I will not introduce them individually, but I would kindly ask you to refer to the conference documentation for the speakers' biographies. Today, we want to focus on the work of regional and national institutions responsible for security and stability to share lessons learned and discuss opportunities to advance a comprehensive approach to security in the face of a changing climate. Without further ado, let's dive right into it. To set the scene, I'd like to start with you, General Robert Kibotchi. General, drawing on your perspectives and your experience in Kenya and East Africa more broadly, can you give us one specific example on how the Kenyan armed forces see the link between climate and security risks on the ground? And perhaps to add on it, what are some of the limitations of only engaging with kinetic force, that means military means, to address these risks? General.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tölken. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Allow me first to start by thanking the OSCE and adelphi for organizing this third annual Climate and Security Conference and inviting me to speak on how the Kenya Defense Forces and particularly the region is responding to this very, very major challenge. Responding to the question that you have posed, Mr. Tölken, the interaction between the effects of climate change and security in Eastern African region, and by Eastern African region, I'm looking at the entire Horn of Africa and the Eastern Africa sub-region. From a defense perspective, you will know that most of the regions that we have, particularly within the Horn, dry and arid areas. And naturally, when the effects of climate change have taken place, there is certainly going to be interaction between the security elements and the effects of climate change. Another key challenge is that these effects have had a major impact on the migration of mainly the pastoralists that depend entirely on the livelihoods on cattle, including other domestic animals. And because of the porosity of the borders of the countries within the region, we, as security agents, are forced to interact very heavily with these dynamics of climate change. One of the key challenges is that as we operate in the border areas trying to combat terrorism and violent extremism, there is now a very thin line between the distinction of those that are genuine migrants and those that are terrorists. And therefore, there is a huge challenge for security agents, particularly for us who are neighboring, particularly Somalia, where, as you know rightly, that the Al-Shabaab terrorist groups operate from. It becomes very, very difficult for us to separate the various bad elements and good elements. And this in itself is a major issue that has affected the manner that we conduct our operations. Now, having said that, it is also true that we, as security agents, have a huge responsibility, particularly in terms of applying other measures, soft measures, towards the mitigation of this migration, which is purely driven by the drivers of water scarcity and pasture scarcity. From a Kenya defense perspective, we've had to post ourselves in a manner that we support the border communities to mitigate against their having to migrate deeper into areas where they would cause conflict, particularly with the farmers.
Okay, thank you, General. Thank you for this insight. Drawing on this, let's focus on the work that key regional and national institutions are doing to advance a comprehensive approach to security in the face of a changing climate. Helga Schmidt, the OSCE is addressing climate change through its comprehensive approach to security, and I recently had the chance to make a small contribution to the discussion in the OSCE. But can you tell us what this entails and what tools you are employing to advance this goal?
Yeah, so first of all, let me say that I'm very happy that we are co-hosting this very important conference, also because I consider climate change really as the challenge of the 21st century, a truly generational challenge. But I'm also proud that for the OSCE, it's nothing new. We have actually our founding document, the Helsinki Final Act, already refers to climate change as a common challenge, and acknowledges the fact very early in 1975 and calls upon the participating states actually to work together on research. We see the work we do as complementary, particularly complementary also to what the UN is doing. And maybe before I come to the more specific work we do, just to say that also the OSCE, with its comprehensive approach to security, which recognized really from the beginning that issues related to peace and security are to be considered also in the context of environmental challenges and, of course, human rights, so I think we are very well placed. Now, I would say there are two important strands of work we do. First, this is to promote dialogue and cooperation. This is done at various levels, experts levels. We do it in the Permanent Council, at the ambassadors level. We have our Economic and Environmental Committee. Of course, the ministerial meetings. It's been a priority for the current chair. So really use every opportunity to promote dialogue, awareness raising, but then we do a lot of programmatic work as well. We have our 16 field operations. For them, this is a key issue, particularly in Central Asia. We have, but we don't do only awareness raising, it's also very concrete projects. So, and here just to give you some examples, we have been working with participating states in Central Asia, South Caucasus, Eastern Europe, most recently also in Southeastern Europe, to first to do awareness raising, but then also to identify and map climate-related security risks at regional level. I think this is particularly important because climate change doesn't stop at the border. So it truly needs regional cooperation. We have identified 42 geographic hotspots and multiple regional, sub-regional challenges in the 4 regions, and we have engaged over 700 local stakeholders in drawing up that list. So this gives us a great evidence base and platform on which to build. And next, we'll be developing now transboundary measures. For example, transboundary cooperation, water management. Particular focuses also on women, particularly in Central Asia, because women can be also very powerful agents of change. We already have a strong track record in countries like Ukraine. I could go on, but I don't want to be too long. These were just some of the concrete examples. So back over to you.
Thank you, Helga. That sounds like a lot of work, and I was not aware of the fact that OSCE has been dealing with climate change already since 1975, so you were early adopters of the issue. Let's take a look at the humanitarian side of things next. Robert Mardini, the ICRC responds to humanitarian crisis in the face of disaster and conflict every day, basically. Could you give us an insight into how your agency is supporting communities affected by the double vulnerability of climate security risks at the moment? And what role do you see development and security institutions playing in supporting you, or at least not hindering your work? Over to you.
Thank you, Heinrich, for having the ICRC at this important panel. So today, what we see is clear. People affected by armed conflict and violence are on the very front line of the climate crisis. 60% of the 25 countries considered today to be the most vulnerable to climate change are affected by an armed conflict. And what we see is that the convergence of climate risk, environmental degradation, and conflict has grave humanitarian consequences on people and their livelihood. It threatens people's lives and health and worsens food, economic, and water insecurity. In many places where we work, this convergence also contributes to loss of livelihoods, displacement, and increased poverty. The impact of such multi-layered crisis can really shape human mobility or access to resources on a continental scale. So how is this reflected in our work? The ICRC's work in more than 80 countries today, working hand in hand with the National Red Cross and Red Crescent societies. So we are adapting our action to really help communities withstand the combined impacts of violence and climate shocks. So it's critical to rebalance efforts and focus more on preventive responses that strengthens people's resilience and adaptive capacities. Short-term fixes are not sufficient, clearly. So for instance, in several countries in the Sahel, we help farmers and herders cope with the increasing variability in rainfall and periods of water scarcity by supporting the rehabilitation of irrigation schemes and the production of animal feed or seed and its storage. We are also working to better understand how climate risks might contribute to the reshaping dynamics of violence and how to factor this into our work to better protect people. And obviously, we alone will not provide all the necessary support to communities dealing with the combined impact of climate risks in conflict. For now, climate action and finance to support this action are particularly weak in places of conflict because of the challenges attached to implementing long-term plans in such environments. So in addition to adapting our own work, we have been mobilizing others to steer and scale up responses. And this really connects to your question about the role of development and security institutions. So on the one hand, we've been working to steer and galvanize humanitarian action in the face of the climate and environmental crisis. The Climate and Environment Charter for Humanitarian Organizations that is now signed, that was launched in May and is signed by more than 115 organizations today, is a testimony to that. We've also been collaborating with key stakeholders, communities, states, development actors, the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, researchers, to call for stronger and holistic climate action in fragile settings and explore what practices work in such environments and how to unlock climate finance. On the development side of things, comprehensive climate adaptation and inclusive development are intrinsically connected. The international community has committed to leaving no one behind. Inclusive development must therefore also happen in places that are enduring conflict, violence, and fragility. On the security side of things, I'd like to stress that we must not oversimplify the relationship between climate risks and conflict, and we should avoid fueling fears of a multiplication of conflicts and of large-scale cross-border migration. Such narrative risks fostering securitized and over-securitized responses rather than responses that contribute to strengthening the resilience of people to a changing climate. Then we need to recognize that damage to the natural environment in armed conflict not only further reduces people's resilience to climate change, it can also contribute to intercommunal violence as a result of loss of livelihoods and increased competition for resources. We see this happening in many places such as South Sudan, Somalia, Lake Chad, the Sahel, and the list goes on and on. Greater respect for international humanitarian law rules that protect the natural environment can limit its degradation. Those rules exist. They need to be respected. And thus, this will reduce the harm and the risks that conflict-affected communities endure. Over to you.
Thank you, Robert. Sounds like a steep learning curve ahead of us. And I especially like your appeal not to exaggerate the risks, but to stay rather mundane and based on figures and facts. Next, I'd like to address Sinead. Sinead, there have been significant institutional developments in the last couple of years that have supported the work of the United Nations Security Council in addressing climate security risks. And Ireland is currently a member of the UN Security Council. How do you see the role of the UNSC in the field vis-a-vis other agencies in the wider UN system? And how can the regional organizations perhaps complement your work? Over to you, Sinead.
Thanks, Henrik, and great to see everybody. I think the first thing I wanted to say is how delighted I am to be in such good company with yourself, Henrik, representing the German government, who have been such champions in this area at the UN Security Council, among other fora. And delighted to see Helga. Helga, last time we worked together, I was based in South Sudan, so I think you and I can very much identify with a lot of what General Kabachi has talked about in the Horn. And General, I really wanted to commend Kenya. You're playing such a leadership role on this topic in the African Union, at the Security Council, among other fora, and ICRC, you know, on a daily basis in countries like South Sudan. You know, you guys are really at the cutting edge of this at an operational level. So yeah, just really delighted to be among I think such like-minded organizations, you know, who really get you know, the increasing criticality essentially of this topic. You're right, Henrik. I mean, we are really seeing movement on this at the Security Council. It's certainly one of Ireland's main priorities, and I think, you know, colleagues will probably be aware the Security Council has been talking about climate and security since 2007. So it's not entirely new, and we have made progress. And I think that has started to accelerate, you know, thanks in part to the leadership, you know, of Germany and Kenya and others. There's a few, I think, tangible things that we've seen. We've seen specific resolutions, regional and country level resolutions on South Sudan, Darfur, Somalia, DRC, Cyprus, Iraq, just to mention a few. And we've also seen at the UN that different institutions have come together, UNEP, UNDP, DPPA, to set up this climate security mechanism, which I think, you know, we believe has a real, you know, potential to enhance the UN's kind of institutional capacity to address these kind of risks. And actually really glad to be able to report that Ireland has just joined the climate security mechanism in this program that we're funding a specific dedicated climate security advisor in the UN mission in South Sudan. And I think in that we're following in Germany's footsteps, who've done something similar in Somalia. And it's really part of Ireland's prioritization of practical steps. We all know there are so many issues for UN missions to mainstream, and we need to give them the resources to do that properly, so that it's not just sort of words on a page. I suppose another big area of progress we've seen is the formation of the informal expert group on climate and security at the Council. Germany kicked it off last year. Ireland are co-chairing it at the moment with Niger, and we're really trying to give other members of the Security Council, strong analysis and I suppose capacity to analyze these kind of risks, so that we can really respond to these challenges. And there's also the group of friends at the Council that Germany and Nauru, sorry, not at the Council, at the broader UN General Assembly that Germany and Nauru are co-chairing, and there's over 60 members now in that. So I think these structures are all really helpful, but what we're trying to do at the moment, as many of you probably know, is see if we can take this to the next level, and that's trying to see if we can get agreement on a thematic resolution on climate and security. So we've, along with Niger, kicked off these discussions. They're ongoing at the moment, building very much on the work, as I said, of Germany in the past. And I think, the key issue here is let's make sure that, any resolution is very clear on the mandate of the UN Security Council and how climate should be addressed within this mandate. And therefore, then how can we be complementary to other organizations, which comes, I think, Henrik, to the last part of your question. How can the Security Council work both within the UN system, but also with organizations like the OSCE and indeed ICRC and others. And I think that the key issues there is, how do we strengthen collective capacity so that we're able to better, analyze and act on the risks that are involved here? How do we build our expertise? But also questions like, so many of us are involved in adaptation and resilience programs, and how do we conflict proof those in a way and make sure that we're really looking at these issues together. But also, and one maybe final point that I'll make is about the opposite. How do we make sure that we look at peace building programs, and we make sure that we are looking at how peace building programs can support climate action and how climate action can support peace. So I think sometimes we talk about climate insecurity, it can become, very negative, climate change, conflict, both very negative things. But how can we try to build synergies so that we have positive actions, in the climate sphere, building on peace actions and vice versa. So I think that is really kind of how we're approaching it at the moment, and really feeling positive about the spirit I think we're finding by and large at the UN Security Council to do more on this, indeed, a generational challenge.
Thank you, Sinead. I like your stress on finding positive action in this complex issue, and certainly we wish you every success with the Council resolution. Now let's take a dive deeper into lessons learned and to ask ourselves what can be done to better take account and address climate fragility risks in your work. So Helga, drawing on your work at the OSCE, what are some of the essential elements perhaps to advance in climate-sensitive conflict prevention, peacekeeping and peace building, and in conflict-sensitive climate action? Can you give us some examples here?
Yes, it's not an easy task, I have to say. One thing that's good about the OSCE is the conflict cycle that is defined really from early warning to early action, to prevention, resolution, then of course also crisis management, conflict rehabilitation. And what we need to do is to introduce a climate lend, so to say, to all of these stages. But I want to say a word on what we heard before, on the need not to over-dramatize or over-securitize climate change, or the link climate change security. And I would say yes and no. It's never good to scare. I was myself the penholder in 2008 of an EU report that established the link between climate change and security and coined the notion threat multiplier. What was meant is that climate change as such is not a threat, but it exacerbates existing vulnerabilities, threats, also because it affects vulnerable countries more than others. But I would agree with you is that it's not good to only see them, recognize the challenges. I think we also need to recognize the opportunities. And so it's the opportunities of collaboration, but then also the economic benefits when it comes to green growth, new technologies. So I think it's very important. The narrative here is very important. What we also need to do is we have to develop maybe a better understanding of the interplay between climate change, adaptation, vulnerability, also of course then conflict prevention. And then it's how do you get ready for early action? So the risk analysis here, the information available is very important. And then the need to engage different stakeholders at all levels, be it the regional, local level, national level, and international level. And then, and this brings me back to the awareness raising, I think we have to make sure that the security actors understand better climate action, but the other way around, the people that work on climate are better aware of the security dimension there that exists. Now you asked me about maybe some concrete examples of what we're doing. It's just so, on the one hand, we continue to bring together the different experts, policymakers on the security impact of climate change, but also the security benefits of climate change cooperation. And then, to give you one example, we brought together, we organized bilateral consultations between Armenia and Georgia on the one hand, and Azerbaijan and Georgia. And this involved really different ministries, agriculture, environment, energy, water, government agencies, etc., academia, experts. So, and in this respect, capacity building, in particular on capacities within regional and international organizations, is very important, because I think this is also where we can learn from each other when it comes to lessons learned. So for the OSCE, I would see for sure scope for closer cooperation with a number of critical actors such as UNFCCC Secretariat and UNDPPA in relation to the climate security mechanism. And maybe one final remark, and that relates also to a current project with Adelphi. We are planning targeted training for women. I already mentioned, I think, the need to engage women as agents for change, but also young people. These are the stakeholders of tomorrow, and they have been particularly vocal on climate change. So last week, young people from around the world met in a pre-COP26 event in Milan, in Italy. It was very interesting to see. I saw the reports that they were really also expressing their frustration with the pace of international response, but were not only expressing their frustration, also made some concrete proposals in terms of what they see as the most pressing issues on the climate change agenda. So in short, I think it's important to involve the right stakeholders, but also collaborate with the right people, because this only we can only tackle this, what I called at the beginning as the challenge for the 21st century, if we have international cooperation at all levels.
Thank you, Helga. Sounds like a lot of learning, getting all the stakeholders on board, doing capacity building, and making sure that people are moving in the right direction. Sinead, you gave us an idea on what kind of work you're doing with which structures, and that you mentioned the thematic resolution that you have in mind. But can you give us some concrete steps, perhaps, that you would foresee for the UN Security Council to promote climate resilient peace, or to make sure that peace is kept on the ground, given all the philosophy and the knowledge that's behind us now? Over to you.
Yeah, Henrik, I think it's a great question. You know, the council, you know, has moved forward in this, but there's certainly more that can be done within that specific peace and security mandate. And of course, you know, the council is just one body, and the organizations on this call will all be a part of the agenda, and are in different ways, and there's sort of top-down, bottom-up elements. I think everybody will recognize that. But to go into a little bit more of what we think the council should do, we actually hosted, as part of our presidency of the council last month, our Prime Minister, our Taoiseach, hosted a high-level open debate on climate and security, and he went into some of these concrete actions that we believe the council can take. You know, noting, you know, I think, as Helga said, this is the challenge of our generation, and that you know, there is more potential for the council to act within its mandate, and I think we really see that as, you know, the council's role in integrating the risks from climate security into all stages, so into conflict prevention work, into peacekeeping work, into conflict resolution work, into post-conflict stabilization work. So it's really all stages where we see the relevance. And then in concrete terms, what our Taoiseach proposed was that the Secretary General of the UN could you know, submit a periodic report to the Security Council in terms of how climate change is threatening the maintenance of international peace and security. He also called for the appointment by the Secretary General of a special representative for climate related security risks. And you know, we believe that this kind of role would both build awareness and also build greater coherence within, you know, the different aspects of the UN system in this way. So and obviously, you know, the resolution is certainly an important step, I think, in this regard, and we're really happy to see during the high-level open debate that there was, you know, quite a few countries who spoke out in support of the notion of the resolution, in order to, you know, different member states spoke about different things, but talking about building capacity, you know, building data and evidence, you know, that would help the council to bring this into, you know, to really, you know, maximize what it can do on this critical area. Now, we're very aware that, you know, there are different views on this topic within the council, and that was also expressed at the high-level debate. You know, we're not all on exactly the same page at the moment, but we really we're hoping, and I think we are getting constructive engagement from council members, and so we will keep these discussions going along with Niger, because we really believe that the resolution can strengthen the council's ability to address these risks, and can you know, put in place some of these kind of concrete actions that will help the council to do that on an ongoing basis. So that's where we are on that, Henrik.
Robert Madini, let's hear from you next. I think we have a couple of people listening into our discussion from the development scene. Do you think that transitional development assistance currently takes adequate account of climate security risks and resilience? And what action would you like to see to better link relief, early recovery, and development support in this context? Robert, over to you.
Thank you, Henrik. What we see in the international aid system is that transitional development assistance in itself remains a notion that really struggles to translate from the conceptual to the very practical. This is seen in efforts around the nexus that have rightfully gained renewed traction since the 2016 World Humanitarian Summit and subsequent grand bargain efforts within the humanitarian sector and donors. However, overcoming intelligently the silos between the development and the humanitarian systems to enable transitional development assistance remains a work in progress. Here in brief is what we see in both worlds when it comes to considering climate security risks and resilience. So the development sector in general is well advanced in its reflection around integrating climate-related considerations in its approaches and programs, yet it really struggles to develop comprehensive and long-term responses in places enduring conflict and violence. Emergency relief actors have traditionally had a much narrower focus on saving lives, understandably so. This has, of course, its rightful place, but approaches also need to reflect that crises are often long-lasting, which calls for more than emergency responses. If you take the top 10 operations of ICRC, for instance, we've been present in those contexts for, on average, 35 years. Humanitarian organizations, and this includes the ICRC, really need to better integrate climate and environmental considerations in their analysis and the design of their responses. This is essential to minimize harmful environment impact and help affected populations better face climate risks without detracting from their primary objective of saving lives. So in short, we see that both development and humanitarian responses in conflict and violence affected environments generally fail to reflect well-integrated short and longer-term climate risks. In terms now of action required to better link relief, early recovery, and development support, if I had to only focus on three, I'd pick the following. First, the need to forge pre-crisis partnerships whereby humanitarian expertise informs development action in at-risk areas. Second, the need for development actors to ensure that their planning and programming tools and partnership models are adapted to the realities of conflict areas. This is to ensure that the programs do no harm, but also to ensure that they integrate what it takes to operate and be accepted in areas that are governed very differently than stable areas. And third, the need for humanitarian actors to broaden the lens through which they assess risks, both in temporal terms and in substantive terms, and to systematically reflect on how their responses can really contribute to strengthening the resilience of affected populations. So in short, we'd like to see a nexus that works, that is a situation where people affected by conflict can safely rebuild their lives with agency and dignity, and where there are no blind spots, no vulnerable people ignored. Sometimes the nexus will need to give preference to humanitarian action, particularly in contexts where reaching people requires an impartial and independent approach. Back to you, Henrik.
Thanks a lot, Robert. I hope that participants from the humanitarian and the development scene carefully listen to the recommendations and the wish list that you just stated here. Thank you. That leads us to the next round of questions where we look into the future and we assess what next steps we could take to advance a multidimensional approach to address climate-related security risks. And I'd like to start with the general. Whilst it is increasingly clear that hard military responses, as we heard, are not usually appropriate to tackle the soft security risks posed by climate change, the security sector does, of course, have an important role to play here. So what can defense forces in general do to better take account of and even address these risks? And can you give us an example of how the Kenyan defense forces are doing this on the ground, General? Over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. I think as has come out very clearly, the the climate change has causes and effects, and obviously it causes transnational threats, which obviously require that they are responded to within a comprehensive approach. And in that context, increasingly within the region, there is a realization that it is going to be, obviously, to be able to respond to the threats caused by climate change by a country individually. And therefore, the multinational approach within the region is critical. And therefore, within the context of the Eastern Africa community, within the context of IGAD, these are areas where, although this cooperation has not gained traction, this is area where defenses organizations from the regional countries can pull together towards responding through soft approaches to the effects of climate change. And when I talk about effects of climate change, these effects are caused by the drivers, for example, as I said, lack of pasture, lack of water by the pastoralist communities, and the defense forces inherently have various capabilities related to engineering capabilities, health, medical capabilities that can be pulled together to address and ameliorate some of the challenges caused by climate change. From a Kenyan perspective, Kenya has realized that and recognized the importance of mainstreaming environment and natural resources issues within the policy level. And as such, Kenya has incorporated environmental security as a part of defense and security architecture that allows that the forces are trained up on how to respond to some of the challenges that they face, whether they are operating along or within the borders or outside the country as peacekeepers. And therefore, Kenya has developed a defense, environmental, and sustainability policy, which aims mainly at enabling the attainment of an all-encompassing national security response to some of these challenges. The Kenya Defense Forces, in particular, in 2003, established at the operational level an environmental soldier program. And this program was intended to respond to the threat that was being caused by climate change and obviously also human causes in depletion of the water sources, particularly the 5 water towers that we have in the country. And therefore, the leadership within the defense establishment established a very robust plan where every unit within the Kenya Defense Forces has an obligation to undertake to reforest some of the and adopt some of these areas that had been depleted either by the cause of human factor or the climate change. And within that context, to date, the Kenya Defense Forces has been able to plant over 28 million trees in all these areas that we have adopted. And from the figures that have come nationally, it would appear that the afforestation effect, not just because we have provided the 28 million trees, has risen from a 3% some 10 years ago to about 7% as we speak today. And therefore, it is an example of where a defense force can be galvanized to be able to support efforts of the government in a holistic manner. Additionally, the Kenya Defense Forces has undertaken to develop a green peace support operations policy. we realized that as we operate outside the country, we need to be able to get the peacekeepers also become agents of mitigating, particularly when we are in places like Somalia with over 5,000 troops. We get to get the troops to also participate in educating the population there on the impact of deforestation and how they can be able to mitigate some of the effects arising from destruction of forests. The other issue is a question of training, capacity building across the force. I think this is important, where it has been doctrinally embedded within the training in the institution, so that it is carried forward as the troops leave their training institutions. Now, this is not to say that there are no challenges and obstacles around the quest to address the climate security issues. But we believe working together presents a very good opportunity, particularly when there is a sense that the ministry in charge of environment has been able to bring together all the other actors so that there's a comprehensive approach. The other issue that is critical, and especially because of the challenges we face with the migration of persons due to lack of water and pasture, one of the key areas is employing defense to establish water resources, water sources in the particular areas that have been affected. As we speak at the moment, I have a number of my engineering capabilities providing support to the pastoralists across the northern part of the country by establishing peace dams there that are able to provide water, because it's water that makes people create conflict. It is pasture that makes people create conflict. So defense has a huge responsibility in addressing some of these effects, including the provision of medical support to the various pastoralists that are affected mainly by the effects of climate change. Over to you.
Thank you. This is really an impressive list of activities, and it shows that your approach is truly multidimensional. Helga, one of the dimensions the General just mentioned was the need for regional cooperation. So this should ring a bell with you, as you are representing a regional organization. So how do you see the role of regional organization in evolving responses to climate-related security risks, and what kind of partnerships would you like to see for a more effective response? And perhaps a short reply, because we're running out of time slowly. Thank you.
Thank you. No, I will try to be short. I think the answer is we need coordinated policy making, both at the national level, but also at the regional level. And indeed here the organization, the OSCE, as the world's largest regional security organization, is in a good place. I will just give you one example. Southeastern Europe has been particularly affected, has been identified as one of the planet's warming hotspots. The region shares several natural resources, like 6 rivers. And what happens with shared natural resources? Of course, it increases the challenges, but also the opportunities if they are seized. So we have done this regional consultation process, and 5 out of the 7 hotspots that we mapped are either shared mountain ecosystems or river basins. And of course, they don't fall neatly within national borders. On the risks identified is uncontrolled land development, is biodiversity loss, and is of course all the disasters we have seen this summer, floods, but also increasingly forest fires. To address it, you have to cooperate among neighbors. You have to establish joint monitoring, also coordination mechanisms. This means you need to share data, you need to harmonize your policies also across the different legal frameworks and the different institutions. This is what we are promoting. And here, maybe last word is, this was just one example. Of course, we do it in the whole OSCE area. I'm encouraging to use the OSCE as a platform to promote solutions on green transition, but also innovation for climate resilience, adaptation and sustainable growth. And this will be my last point, and this relates to something I said earlier on. We need to have a positive debate, also positive narrative. We need to appreciate, yes, the security threats, but we also need to focus on the opportunities, including opportunities that cooperation represents, but also the economic opportunities, and we also have to highlight that. And this relates to green technology, green growth, first of all. So that would be my answer in short. Thank you.
Thank you. I like your point of stressing opportunities, and challenges are only thorny opportunities. That's what we learned. Robert, what risk assessment tools does the ICRC use, and how can tools and knowledge on climate security linkages be improved to facilitate better and more coordinated action across the humanitarian, peace building, sustainable development divide? Because you mentioned earlier there's some learning to do. Over to you, Robert.
Well, thank you. Understanding and assessing security risk is really core to our work day in and day out. It is central to our protection work and to our approach to gain access in hard-to-reach areas, to assess and manage the security of our own staff. How do we do this? Well, we listen to people a lot. And I mean all people, communities, armed groups, local and national authorities, national societies, the media, researchers. We do our very best to be connected to the places where we work and to nurture the dialogue that really help us understand the dynamics of conflicts, how people are impacted, how they are coping, how they are struggling. Our long-term physical presence in many of the places where we work, our close connection to local communities, and our ability to observe, listen, and learn are absolutely key in that regard. In fact, they remain the most important tools to manage risks. Technical tools and methodologies, of course, can help, but they cannot replace the human element. And people have really long raised climate-related risks when we speak with them in those very discussions. Communities speak of their access to water or lack thereof, of the impact of floods or drought on their harvests, on changing patterns of transhumance that disrupt their lives and livelihoods. And we constantly adapt our responses to better meet people's need. We have also progressively worked to better address such risks. Having said that, more recent for us is to try assessing climate-related risks directly. And this year marks really a first in that our delegations are using a risk matrix to analyze such risks and assess how they can be integrated in our responses that is very often carried out with our Red Cross and Red Crescent movement partners. We've been lucky enough to benefit from the support also of climate experts in the last few years, and this is helping us develop our own climate literacy. As this is relatively new, we know that we still need to strengthen the analysis of how combined climate and security risks intersect and exacerbate existing vulnerabilities. And to your question on how to improve tools and the knowledge and ensure a more coordinated and comprehensive action, I think we all intuitively know the answer. We need to find ways to ensure that our common analysis is strengthened and that our responses complement one another. We may not always directly join forces. It is critical for us, for instance, to keep our access and ability to work in an independent, impartial, and neutral manner. We are able to nurture a dialogue with armed groups and keep access to territories under their control because we are guided by humanitarian needs, not by political objectives, because we are independent and not part of national development plans, and because we do not take sides in conflicts or in any political debates. So we need to preserve this, but we can also ensure that our respective responses are mutually reinforcing in helping people to be more resilient to growing risks. These two objectives are not mutually exclusive. They are interdependent and equally important to me. Back to you, Henrik.
Thank you, Robert. And finally, Sinead, what do you think? What needs to be done to strengthen the voices of those most strongly affected by climate security risks and support local and regional efforts in this regard? Also, perhaps a short answer. We only have 2 or 3 minutes left.
I'll do my best. Yeah, look, I think we can take for granted from all of our collective experience that vulnerable groups, such as women, are going to be, that those vulnerabilities are going to be compounded in this. So I won't dwell on that. I think we all know that. We've seen the studies that that the worst impact of natural disasters is of women, and so on and so forth. So in terms of what we can do about this, I think this also comes back to what Helga and others have mentioned about how we link with climate adaptation work. There's a lot of climate finance, that is not going to adaptation. There is a lot of adaptation finance that is not going to the poorest, to the conflict affected, to the fragile states. And even within that, then, how much of that actually gets to the local level. So these are really, really big priorities for Ireland. We actually, over the last few months, we got together with some other countries and we set up something called the Champions Group on Adaptation Finance. Very happy to report that Germany are our newest member when we launched it at UNGA a couple of weeks ago. And that's really to try to improve the quantity and the quality of adaptation finance. And one of the key points on the quality side is, I believe, from my experience in conflict and fragile affected states, a particular weakness, which is how does adaptation finance work in those kind of contexts. So I think that's really important. And also then looking at, coming to Robert's point about listening at the local level, how do we get the funds to that level? And maybe just the last point I'll make, acknowledging also, Adelphi's role in this. Ireland recently joined the Weathering Risk initiative, and similar to the OSCE, we are having our climate literacy and our climate and security literacy built by our participation in this program and by Adelphi. And one of the areas that we're trying to improve on specifically is precisely that issue of how we tackle those kind of compounded vulnerabilities. And I think we also think that our new involvement in the climate and security mechanism will help us to get better at that. So I'll leave it at that, Henrik. Thanks.
Thank you, Sinead. Thank you to all of you. That was a fantastic discussion, and thank you for sharing your experiences and exploring together what additional capacities are required to go forward. So let me come to the closing of this session and perhaps the conference all in all. Looking back 10 years ago, I was part of the process initiating German action on climate and security back in 2011 in the Security Council. And I'm delighted to see that the process has moved on, to see the fruits of our efforts around putting climate security on the international agenda. They have come very far, truly. When we launched the Berlin Call to Action in 2019 at our first BCSC conference, the hope was, of course, that this was the start of a process, a call to action to do just that, to move from analysis to action. And I think we've seen real commitment and concrete evidence of this over the course of this third Berlin Climate and Security Conference. We've heard it in the words of the German Foreign Minister, Heiko Maas, from speakers during this session, during the opening session, and the 22 excellent sessions we had over these 2 weeks. Participants and partners engaged in this rich debate and showed that we really are making good strides, moving the climate security agenda forward. When it comes to action, Germany is proud to be leading Weathering Risk. You just mentioned it, Sinead, the multilateral initiative that we launched last year and which so many of you are partnering with and supporting. As well as improving foresight on climate-related security risks, the initiative is already supporting the development and implementation of sustainable solutions on the ground in Mali and Somalia, to name but a few. And I'm glad to see that this action is spreading in the UN, the regional organizations such as OSCE and the AU, in the EU and NATO, and among so many civil society stakeholders. It makes me happy and gives me hope to see you all attend this conference and contribute to improving your responses to these risks. And with that, I draw this session to a close. I thank you once again, and I hope to see you again next year. But before completely closing the conference, I hand over to State Secretary Niels Annen for the closing remarks. Mr. Annen, over to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to bring the third Berlin Climate and Security Conference to a close. Over the course of these 2 weeks of engaging and practical discussions, we have learned and shared insights on vital issues relating to climate and security. From the links between climate change, conflict in food systems, the role of women and youth, to the devastating impacts on environmental defenders, the discussion helps us to move beyond words, to identify practical solutions and ways towards actions. Since we established the conference and launched the Berlin Call to Action in 2019, we have succeeded not simply in convening an important annual conference, but also in creating a dynamic community of practice for climate security. This is thanks to you, participants, speakers, moderators, and partners who represent a broad and ever-growing range of stakeholders, generously engaging, sharing and learning together to advance our efforts to address climate-related risks to peace and security over the past weeks. Together, I believe that we have advanced our goal of identifying better ways of understanding, anticipating, and actually addressing climate security risks. Ladies and gentlemen, we know that whilst we need global action, responses need to address the localized risks unfolding on the ground. That is why we are so engaged with climate security through different initiatives, as Minister Maas outlined in his initial statement to the conference. Foresight is of particular importance in this regard, and we are particularly proud to lead Weathering Risk, the multilateral initiative we launched last year, and which so many of you support. It will improve context-specific foresight on these risks and develop and implement local solutions. I am glad to see this action spread. I commend the excellent progress made by the Berlin Climate and Security Conference on climate security activities in Southeastern Europe. I also welcome the important progress made by Ireland and now Kenya in stewarding this critical issue at the United Nations Security Council. And I am happy to see Germany's regional climate security initiative Green Central Asia unfold. Ladies and gentlemen, one resounding outcome of the Berlin Climate and Security Conference is a clear call for multilateral, multi-stakeholder common agenda for action to address climate security risks. The BCSC is not the end of this process. We will meet again with our partners, the Munich Security Conference and adelphi at COP26 in November to move this important agenda forward. The climate commitments made at COP26 are fundamentally about ensuring the continuation of a safe and dignified life on Earth. For the sake of future generations, we will strive to promote peace and stability at every step. Thank you very much.